June 19, 1944. The deck of the USS Lexington shudders as the last F-6F Hellcat slams onto the steel, tailhook screaming, engine coughing hot oil into the Pacific air. The sun is already high. The smell of aviation fuel hangs heavy. Deck crews run forward, counting planes as they always do, one by one. Then again, and again. The pilots climb down from their cockpits with salt on their faces and something unfamiliar in their expressions. Not exhaustion, not shock, some are grinning. A few are laughing, not loudly, not boastfully, but in the stunned way men laugh when reality has outrun expectation. In the ready rooms below deck, numbers begin to circulate. Kill tallies that sound wrong. Reports that feel exaggerated even to the men who filed them. Entire enemy formations intercepted. Broken apart, erased. Japanese air wings that had taken years to build, gone in hours. Out beyond the carrier task force, the Philippine Sea lies calm and empty, hiding the wreckage beneath its surface. What just happened here did not feel like a battle. It felt like the sudden collapse of an era, and to understand why, we have to step back to the world that made this moment inevitable. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase neither side had fully imagined at its beginning. What had started with shock and momentum for Japan in December 1941 had transformed into a grinding contest of distance, production, and adaptation. The vast ocean that once protected the Japanese Empire was now working against it. Japan's early victories had been built on a narrow foundation, a small, elite cadre of naval aviators. Aircraft designed for range and maneuverability over durability, a doctrine that prized individual skill and aggressive offense. At Pearl Harbor, in the skies over the Philippines and across the Dutch East Indies, that system had worked brilliantly and briefly. But it was never designed for attrition. Japanese naval aviation had entered the war with fewer than 2,000 trained carrier pilots. Each one took years to prepare. Combat losses were expected to be minimal, victories decisive. There was no deep reserve, no rapid training pipeline. When experienced aviators were lost at Coral Sea and Midway in 1942, the damage was structural, not temporary. The men who replaced them were less trained, rushed forward to fill cockpits their instructors once occupied. Across the Pacific, the United States was fighting a very different kind of war. American planners understood early that the conflict would be long, industrial, relentless. By 1943, U.S. factories were producing aircraft faster than Japan could replace losses. Carriers were launched in pairs and trios. Pilots were trained in systems, not as lone aces. Every sortie was part of a wider machine. Technology followed the same philosophy. Radar was no longer experimental. It was integrated. Combat information centers tracked enemy movements in real time, vectoring fighters before opposing pilots ever saw an American ship. Carrier decks became moving airfields tied together by radios, doctrine, and procedure. The Japanese Navy knew the balance was shifting. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that the outcome was uncertain. Yamamoto was dead by 1943, shot down by American fighters guided by intelligence and timing. His absence was more than symbolic. It left a leadership vacuum at a moment when Japan needed adaptation most. By early 1944, the United States had driven steadily westward across the Pacific. The Marshall Islands fell. Airfields crept closer to Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Each new American base shortened flight distances and tightened the noose. For Japan, the next line of defense was clear. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, these islands were not just stepping stones. They were strategic keystones. From their airfields, American B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time, not with raids, with sustained bombing campaigns. If the Marianas fell, the war would move from the perimeter to the heart of the empire. Japan could not allow that to happen. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled what remained of its striking power into a single force. It was called the Mobile Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. On paper, it looked formidable. 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was intended to draw the U.S. Navy into one decisive engagement, a final, crushing blow that would reverse the tide. But paper strength masked reality. Many of the aircraft were obsolete. Pilots had fewer flight hours. Fuel shortages limited training. Carrier decks were crowded with men who had never landed under fire. Japanese doctrine still emphasized offensive strikes at extreme range, assuming surprise and coordination that no longer existed. Opposing them was the largest carrier force the world had ever seen, U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, brought 15 fast carriers, hundreds of modern fighters, and a fully matured system of radar-directed defense. Their aircraft, particularly the F-6F Hellcat, were faster, tougher, and heavily armed. Their pilots had trained for this exact kind of battle. Both sides knew a collision was coming. Reconnaissance aircraft searched the horizon. Submarines reported movements. Radio silence stretched nerves thin. Somewhere beyond the curvature of the Earth, two air fleets were moving toward each other. One built on experience and innovation, the other on fading doctrine and hope. The confrontation over the Philippine Sea would not simply decide the fate of the Marianas. It would decide the future of naval aviation itself. And as dawn approached on June 19, 1944, both sides prepared to launch everything they had left.
In the days leading up to the battle, the Pacific was deceptively quiet. Beneath the surface, however, two immense naval forces were maneuvering with deliberate caution, each aware that the next engagement could reshape the war. Vice Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet steamed eastward from the Philippines, threading through the vastness of the sea with a single goal: to strike the American carriers before U.S. land-based aircraft could tip the balance. Ozawa's plan relied on distance. Japanese carrier aircraft had longer nominal range than their American counterparts. If his pilots could strike from beyond American reach, they might cripple the U.S. fleet before it could respond. But that advantage existed only on paper. Fuel shortages had curtailed flight training for months. Many Japanese pilots had logged barely half the hours considered combat-ready. In 1941, navigation skills suffered. Formation discipline was uneven. Worse still, the Japanese fleet lacked a reliable radar picture. Spotters and scouts were tasked with finding an enemy force that could strike them long before they knew it was there. The Americans, by contrast, were waiting. Task Force 58 was divided into 4 carrier groups, each layered with combat air patrols, radar picket destroyers, and overlapping defensive zones. Radar screens glowed through the night, operators tracking every unidentified blip. Combat information centers worked without pause, plotting courses, calculating speeds, predicting intentions. Admiral Spruance faced his own dilemma. His primary mission was not to destroy the Japanese fleet at any cost, but to protect the invasion of Saipan already underway. Aggressive pursuit risked exposing the transport ships. Caution risked letting the Japanese strike first. Mitchell, commanding the carriers, prepared his air groups regardless. His pilots were briefed not for a single decisive strike, but for layered interception wave after wave of fighters ready to be launched the moment enemy aircraft appeared. At dawn on June 19th, Japanese scout planes fanned out across hundreds of miles of ocean. Some failed to return. Others sent fragmented reports. Distance distorted everything. Contacts were misidentified. American carriers were reported farther away than they were. Some Japanese commanders believed they had hours. In reality, they had minutes. Shortly after 8 a.m., radar operators aboard American ships detected large formations approaching from the west. The blips were unmistakable. Dozens, then hundreds. Mitchell ordered fighters into the air. Hellcats roared off carrier decks in disciplined streams, climbing toward assigned altitudes. Pilots received vectors by radio, guided by unseen hands in darkened rooms below deck. The Japanese pilots, flying without radar support, had no idea they were already being hunted. The first wave of Japanese aircraft fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes flew toward the American fleet in loose formations stretched by distance and navigation errors. Escort fighters struggled to maintain cohesion. Some pilots pressed forward alone, others fell behind, engines straining. They expected surprise instead. They flew into a sky already crowded with American fighters. What followed would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that sounded flippant, even cruel. But on that morning, there was nothing casual about what unfolded. It was the collision of two systems, one refined by experience and industry, the other eroded by loss and inflexibility. As the first Japanese wave closed in, American pilots saw them clearly for the first time, aircraft silhouetted against the sun, engines burning hot, wings heavy with bombs and torpedoes. Orders crackled over the radio, targets were assigned, altitudes adjusted. The battle was about to begin, not as a chaotic melee, but as a controlled interception unfolding exactly as American planners had envisioned. And from the moment the first shots were fired, it became clear that this would not be a contest measured in narrow margins. It would be decided in sweeping arcs of smoke, flame, and falling aircraft, with consequences neither side could yet fully grasp. At the heart of the battle were men, young, trained, afraid, determined, separated not by courage, but by preparation. American carrier pilots in 1944 were not expected to be heroes. They were expected to be competent. Many had flown hundreds of hours before ever seeing combat. They practiced interceptions, gunnery, formation flying, and carrier landings until procedure replaced panic. Japanese pilots, by contrast, carried the weight of a vanished generation. In 1941 and 1942, naval aviators had been elite warriors, forged through brutal training. By 1944, most of those men were dead. Their replacements arrived with...
For Japanese pilots who survived the first engagements, confusion replaced confidence. Formations that had launched together were gone. Radios crackled with fragmented calls, reports of enemy fighters everywhere, of escorts missing, of fuel draining faster than expected. Some pilots pressed on toward the American fleet, only to encounter layered defenses they had never trained against. Anti-aircraft fire rose in dense walls. Fighters descended again and again, attacking from angles that felt omnipresent. The sense of initiative, once central to Japanese air doctrine, evaporated. Back aboard Ozawa's carriers, flight decks remained ready for aircraft that would never return. Crewmen watched the sky, counting minutes, then hours. When survivors finally landed, their aircraft were riddled with holes, their crews shaken. Reports spoke not of setbacks, but of annihilation. The realization spread quietly at first. This was not a temporary reversal. The air arm was being destroyed faster than it could be deployed. American pilots began to recognize the pattern mid-battle. Each new wave was smaller, less organized. Easier to intercept, radio chatter shifted in tone, from urgency to disbelief. Kill counts climbed so fast that squadron leaders warned against exaggeration. Only to confirm the numbers later, this was not triumphalism, it was disorientation. Battles were not supposed to feel like this. The enemy was supposed to fight back harder. For the Japanese, the effect was devastating. Pilots who returned spoke of endless fighters, of skies that belonged entirely to the enemy. Confidence, already fragile, cracked. Doctrine that demanded aggression now felt like a sentence, not a strategy. The human cost was mounting. And morale collapsed alongside aircraft. The battle exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Naval aviation had changed. Victory no longer belonged to those who struck first or flew farthest. It belonged to those who could see farther, coordinate better, and replace losses. Japan's doctrine, once visionary, had become rigid. The United States had built flexibility into every layer, from training to command to logistics. The Philippine Sea was where those philosophies collided openly. By late afternoon, it was clear the Japanese mobile fleet had lost something irreplaceable. Not just aircraft, not just pilots, but the belief that it could still dictate the terms of battle. As the sun dipped lower, the sky grew quieter. Fewer enemy aircraft appeared on radar. The American fighters remained aloft, waiting. And then came the moment when waiting turned into realization, when numbers, wreckage, and silence confirmed that the decisive turning point had already passed. The decisive moment, did not arrive with a single explosion or sinking ship. It unfolded over hours, measured in radar contacts, fuel gauges, and vanishing enemy formations. Shortly after 10 a.m., the second major Japanese strike wave approached from the west. It was larger than the first, but no better coordinated. Radar operators tracked it with clinical precision. Course, speed, altitude, everything was known before visual contact. Mitcher ordered additional fighters aloft. Hellcats climbed into position, spreading across the sky in layered patrols. Pilots tightened their formations, checked ammunition, and waited for the vectors that would place them exactly where the enemy would pass. When contact came, it was immediate and overwhelming. American fighters plunged through the Japanese formations, firing short, controlled bursts. Aircraft disintegrated mid-air. Engines caught fire. Wings folded under stress they were never designed to endure. Torpedo planes, slow and vulnerable, were cut down before they could descend toward attack altitude. Japanese escort fighters attempted to intervene, but they were outnumbered and outperformed. Every defensive maneuver cost altitude and speed, advantages the Americans refused to surrender. The sky became a vertical battlefield, with Hellcats striking from above, breaking off, then climbing again to repeat the process. By noon, reports confirmed what pilots were already sensing. Entire Japanese strike groups had failed to reach the fleet. Those that did were scattered remnants, arriving piecemeal into prepared defenses. Below, American ships fired only occasionally. Anti-aircraft gunners tracked targets that never quite reached effective range. The battle was being decided far from the decks they protected. Ozawa continued to launch aircraft, believing some of his earlier waves had broken through. He could not see the empty sea where his pilots had fallen. Communications lagged. Reports contradicted one another. Hope filled the gaps where information should have been. By early afternoon, a third Japanese wave was detected, smaller, rushed, and desperate. Many aircraft were piloted by men on their first combat mission. They flew straight into the same system that had destroyed those before them. The result was swift. American pilots later described the sky as open. Targets were everywhere. Resistance was sporadic. Coordination among the Japanese formations collapsed entirely. And still, the Japanese fleet waited for a decisive strike that would never come down as the last enemy aircraft were shot down or driven away. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Radar screens cleared. The sea stretched empty again. The turning point had already passed. Not with drama, but with certainty. Yet the full meaning of what had just happened would only become clear when the American pilots turned back toward their carriers. As the final Japanese aircraft disappeared from radar, American pilots began the long flight home. Fuel gauges dipped into the red, engines ran hot. The adrenaline that had carried them through combat ebbed, replaced by calculation and fatigue. One by one, Hellcats appeared over the carrier groups. Landing signals flashed. Deck crews moved into position. Aircraft touched down hard, some riddled with holes, others almost untouched. Pilots climbed out and removed their helmets in silence at first. Then the numbers began to circulate. Squadron leaders compared notes. Gun camera footage was reviewed. Claims were checked against radar tracks and missing enemy contacts. The figures kept aligning. Japanese losses were not in the dozens. They were in the hundreds. On June 19th alone, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost more than 300 aircraft. Entire air groups ceased to exist in a single day. American losses were minimal by comparison, fewer than 30 aircraft destroyed in air combat. Pilots struggled to process it. Some laughed quietly, shaking their heads, repeating the numbers as if saying them out loud might make them false. It was not joy. It was disbelief, the reaction of men who had trained for hard, costly battles and instead encountered something closer to collapse. Admiral Mitcher reviewed the reports with measured restraint. He understood what the raw numbers meant. Japan's carrier air arm had been gutted. Experienced pilots were gone. Training pipelines could not replace them. The balance of naval aviation had tipped irreversibly, but the battle was not entirely over. On June 20th, American reconnaissance finally located Ozawa's retreating fleet at extreme range. Mitcher faced a difficult decision: launch a long-distance strike late in the day, risking pilots running out of fuel on the return, or allow the enemy to escape with his remaining carriers intact, he chose to strike. American aircraft launched into the fading light, flying hundreds of miles over open ocean. They found the Japanese fleet near dusk and attacked with everything they had left. One carrier was sunk, others were damaged. But darkness fell quickly. The return flight was perilous. Fuel run out, pilots ditched at sea. Mitcher ordered carrier lights turned on, a risky move that exposed the fleet to guide his pilots home. Many survived because of that decision. When the final tallies were complete, the outcome was undeniable. The Japanese Navy had lost nearly 400 aircraft and the majority of its remaining trained carrier pilots. The Americans had lost fewer than 130 aircraft, many due to fuel exhaustion rather than combat. Japan was stunned. Not by a single blow, but by the realization that an entire air wing, built over decades, had been erased in 2 days. And as the wreckage settled beneath the Philippine Sea, the war itself shifted course. The immediate aftermath of the battle was marked by an absence that spoke louder than celebration. Japanese carriers still floated. Battleships remained intact on the surface. The Mogul fleet had survived. But beneath that surface, something essential was gone. Air wings that had once defined Japanese naval power no longer existed. Reports reaching Tokyo were grim and fragmented. Aircraft losses were catastrophic. Pilot casualties were irreplaceable. Many of the men lost over the Philippine Sea were among the last carrier aviators with any meaningful combat experience. Training programs at home could not compensate. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Aircraft production, already strained, could not match American output. The Imperial Japanese Navy faced a truth it could not publicly admit. Its carriers were now little more than empty decks. For the United States, assessments were cautious but unmistakably confident. Intelligence analysts confirmed that Japanese naval aviation had been effectively neutralized as an offensive force. Future carrier battles, once feared, now appeared unlikely to challenge American air superiority. Strategically, the implications were immediate. With Japanese carrier air power shattered, the invasion of the Marianas continued without serious naval interference. Saipan fell after brutal fighting on land. Tinian and Guam followed. Airfields were built with relentless speed. Within months, B-29 bombers began flying from the Marianas toward Japan itself. The psychological impact extended beyond strategy. Japanese commanders who had believed in a decisive fleet engagement now confronted the failure of that doctrine. Plans shifted toward desperate measures, kamikaze tactics that reflected not innovation but exhaustion. American naval planners, meanwhile, adjusted their expectations upward. Carrier task forces could now operate with confidence previously unimaginable. The enemy could still fight, still inflict losses, but no longer on equal terms. The balance of initiative had shifted permanently. As the Pacific War moved closer to Japan's shores, the memory of the Philippine Sea lingered as a warning and a benchmark. It had not been a narrow victory. It had been systemic destruction, and yet its full consequences would only become clear as the months unfolded. In the months that followed, the effects of the battle rippled outward through every level of the Pacific War. What had been decided in the air over the Philippine Sea now reshaped operations thousands of miles away. Japanese carriers continued to sail, but they sailed hollow. Without trained air groups, they could no longer project power. They became decoys, logistical burdens rather than strategic assets. When they appeared again, at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, they did so not as striking forces, but as bait meant to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches. The transformation was complete. Japan's once feared carrier fleet had been reduced to a tool of distraction. The loss of pilots proved even more devastating than the loss of ships. Carrier aviation was not something that could be rebuilt quickly. It required years of training, steady fuel supplies, and experienced instructors, all things Japan now lacked. New pilots were rushed into service with minimal preparation, often sent directly into combat with little chance of survival. American airmen noticed the difference immediately. Subsequent engagements showed fewer enemy aircraft, poorer coordination, and a growing reliance on suicide attacks rather than conventional tactics. The sky, once contested, increasingly belonged to the United States. For American pilots, the battle became a reference point. Many would later say they knew the war had changed that day. Not because Japan had surrendered, it would fight on fiercely, but because the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was no longer if the United States would reach Japan, but when industrial momentum accelerated, carrier groups rotated forward. New pilots arrived fully trained, seamlessly integrated into veteran units. Losses were replaced. Experience accumulated. By early 1945, American naval aviation operated with near-total dominance. Strikes against Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands unfolded under skies largely free of organized opposition. The lineage of that dominance traced directly back to June 1944. Historians would later identify the Battle of the Philippine Sea as the last great carrier versus carrier confrontation of the war. After it, Japan could no longer challenge. American naval air power in open battle, the Pacific had become an American-controlled highway. And with that control came the final, irreversible approach toward Japan itself, an approach shaped not by a single dramatic moment, but by a quiet realization born in disbelief, wreckage, and empty skies. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not remembered for burning ships or shattered coastlines. It left no ruined cities behind, no photographs of devastated harbors. Its significance lay almost entirely in what disappeared, aircraft that never returned. Pilots who never learned why their sky had betrayed them, a doctrine that collapsed without ceremony. It marked the moment when naval aviation stopped being a contest of daring individuals and became a contest of systems. Training pipelines. Radar screens, logistics, the invisible structures that decide battles long before the first shot is fired. Courage did not vanish from the skies that day, it was simply overwhelmed by preparation. For the American pilots who returned laughing in disbelief, the reaction was not cruelty or arrogance. It was the human response to an outcome that defied expectation. They had trained for losses, for chaos, for desperate fights. Instead, they encountered absence, an enemy undone before it could truly engage. For Japan, the loss was existential. Without its carrier air arm, the empire could no longer shape the war's direction. It could only react, adapt, and eventually endure the consequences of strategic isolation. History often remembers decisive moments as explosions or surrender ceremonies. But some turning points arrived quietly, measured in empty skies and silent radar screens. In June 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the future of the Pacific War was decided not by spectacle, but by inevitability, and the laughter that followed was not victory's voice, but disbelief at how completely an era had ended.